Welcome back to the Khizr Studio Podcast. In the Khizr Studio Podcast, we aim to have kind of conversations around architecture, landscape architecture and urbanism, but specifically looking at how kind of political, social and economic forces affect the way we design our spaces. And I'm really happy today to be with a good friend of mine, Tom Rowntree. Thomas is founder of Tom Studios and social media content creator and an architectural designer. And
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for coming, and you're very much the expert on podcast, Tom. So,
Well,
I will call me out if I'm doing anything wrong here.
I will. I'll make sure whenever you and an R, and I'll I'll jump in.
I tend to do that a lot. So.
I wouldn't say I'm an expert in any shape or form. I've done podcasts myself. I had the student podcast. Seems like ages ago now, but it was only actually 3-4 years ago.
It's worth. So you're in practice now, but you finished your part 2 last year.
Yeah, so I finished my master's degree last July or June or May even. I think it was May. Graduated in July, and yeah, it's been a year since I've graduated. It's gone by pretty quickly. I'm now back in practice, trying to finish my full qualification and hopefully become an architect within the next 12 months, which would be nice. So hopefully in a year's time when we sit back down again and potentially have another conversation, I can sit down and say I'm an architect, which would be, hopefully, fingers crossed, be good.
Fingers crossed, yeah, it'll be amazing. But you've also got this kind of like other side to some of the work you do. I mean, when we first met, you were doing this amazing, like you were one of the only people I'd seen who were in the architectural space producing film and trying to communicate architecture through film. And you're using specifically social media as an outlet for that.
Yeah, I think the whole conversation when we get into the whole world of how I started video and social media, I mean, I could take it way back when I started the whole YouTube journey, the whole social media journey. All I was trying to do was document my journey through architecture, and because I realized very early on that there wasn't many people in the social media space that are openly talking about the process of studying architecture and what it's like to be an architecture student and the journey going through architecture school. Because as you well know, the process of going through architecture school is rough, and it's a challenging journey and a challenging process, and there's so many things involved that people don't quite understand until they get into it. And so my intention was to start documenting my journey in order to help educate students through their journey and make them feel like they're not the only person that's struggling or the only person that is finding it difficult to visualize their ideas and put together their portfolios. And throughout that journey, I very much got more and more into video and more into the process of video and what it really was and what story I was trying to tell, what I was trying to communicate through my videos. Because at the end of the day, so many people are picking up a camera and talking about their journey. I wanted to figure out what was going to make me different to someone else who was documenting their journey in architecture. Although I was one of the only people doing it at the time, I wanted to really kind of stamp my style in what I was doing. So then that's when I went into the whole kind of visual side of it and the cinematography and the really aesthetic tone to my content, because I felt like that was a really strong style and an appropriate style for platforms like Instagram, which is a very visual and engaging platform. And yeah, I mean, obviously we met 2 years ago now, 18 months ago, and we worked together on a project which was really cool, and it's great looking back on that kind of stuff because it feels like an absolute age ago. But it's a whole journey, and I mean, we can go a lot more detail into the whole communication side of it and storytelling, but essentially that's how I got into this social media world.
Yeah, and when we met, I remember that you were in your first year of part 2, I think.
Yep.
And
first year masters.
You just started.
Yep.
Actually, you were a few months
Yep.
into it, and I remember your content. Like you said, it's always had this sense of trying to be a place for other architect students to come and feel like they can understand and feel like they can relate to you and your journey. How has that changed now that you're in practice? How have you found your content's changed versus being a part 2 student?
Yeah, it's obviously had to adapt, and I think my page constantly adapts and the brand constantly adapts, and I think that's important to stay fresh and to stay current and to kind of evolve with the times. But a big shift was obviously going from documenting my own personal journey within architecture school, and obviously it all being very specific to me and my journey, So then now it's more about my advice to an individual on their journey, rather than it being specifically about me and what I'm doing, and this is my drawing, this is my project. And I used to obviously speak in a lot of depth about my projects and a lot of depth about my process, which I still do to some degree, but it shifted ever so slightly more about, let me help you on your journey rather than me. So it still has that personal touch, it's still very much my brand, it's still very much my face on the brand. It's literally called Khizr Studios, which is obviously my name, Thomas Rowntree. And so I still have that personal touch, but it's just shifted ever so slightly in terms of bringing a more professional tone and kind of leveling it up slightly away from architecture school and more into being a young professional, which very much aligns with me as well and my current position and my journey of becoming an architect. So there's quite a lot of facets to my social media. It's quite hard to define exactly what it is, but essentially it's about documenting and communicating my journey in order to help others.
And it's interesting because like there's now it's becoming more popular, but actually bringing architecture into the social media sort of platform, it's an interesting. It's kind of almost a fresh use of bringing two worlds together in a way.
Yeah.
Where do you see it going in the future? Do you see your content addressing the same sorts of problems and the same types of audiences, or like you just said, like is it going to grow with you? And as you become an architect, a qualified architect, do you think the content will reflect that?
Yeah, I think it'll always grow with me and my brand, just because I think with social media, having that personal side to your brand is really important for authenticity, for trust, for relatability. There's so many facets of having a personal brand that really helps build an audience that is engaging and essentially a community. You make a very good point in that the social media space, the architecture social media space, is evolving quickly. There's so many new architecture student profiles now, or even just architecture profiles in general. I think only recently the industry started to pick up on social media and the value of social media, and I think architecture in general has always been slightly behind the curve in many facets of what we do. Technology, we drew only up till 10-15 years ago. We did everything by hand, whereas, and I still think it's very much prominent that we are still behind the curve in many facets. And so I feel like social media is just another one of those things where we're kind of playing catch up, and we're trying to keep up with many other industries that are obviously utilizing social media as their main marketing platform. And so I feel like in the next few years, I hope that, especially through my journey and trying to help people understand the value of social media and the value of storytelling through online, building communities, creating authentic content and engaging content, I do think that social media with architecture is going to evolve constantly. And in terms of my profile, I still feel like I said, it'll be very personal, but I also feel like I'm starting to kind of specialize in the areas such as communication, such as storytelling, which obviously links, because I feel like there is, at the end of the day, in architecture, communication is such a fundamental tool that we have. Essentially, it is the most important tool that we have. Whether it's us having a conversation right now, we've been able to formulate an actual conversation, whether it's selling an idea to a client through a very quick sketch, whether it's putting together a planning application and communicating in a document to the authorities or the local council how we can propose this scheme, or whether it's a university where we're putting together a portfolio of work that we're presenting to critiques or tutors. Everything that we do is communication. Everything that we do relates to communication, how we can efficiently and effectively communicate an idea as easy as possible to an individual. And the same applies for social media. I see a lot of parallels between the two in terms of social media is exactly the same thing. What we're trying to do is communicate an idea as simply and effectively as possible to the viewer. Obviously, social media has more levels to it in terms of engagement, viewership, followers, and you have to, obviously social media is very fast paced, you have to grab someone's attention very quickly in order for them to engage with the content. But the same principles apply in that we need to be able to communicate ideas easily and effectively to an individual who might not know anything about the profession or not know anything about the project. And so yeah, all reverts back, I'm going on a tangent here, but all reverts back to, I think communication and storytelling is becoming my kind of specialty and the direction that I want my content to go in, because I'm realizing more and more the necessity of communication and storytelling within the architecture industry. And social media is a great way of communicating those ideas and communicating that, because social media, essentially the crux of social media is to facilitate conversation, to facilitate communication. So yeah.
And it's also one thing I found in working with practice is it's usually working with practices. Usually it's the younger practices which are taking initiative and being quite innovative with social media.
Yeah.
And it's that idea that you can, on the internet or on social media, a fairly small team of architects can appear much larger and much more prominent and much more relevant through an active presence on social media. And it comes back to what you were saying about personalizing yourself, and you're saying, you know, your social media presence obviously is going to grow with you. And it's almost, if you think about it from a practice's point of view, it gives a practice that outlet to have that personal connection, that proximity with their potential end users, with potential clients, but actually beyond that, the general public. And if the general public are able to engage with us as an industry in a language that they understand, i.e. the language of social media, which is so prominent today, then they're more likely to understand what it takes to design great spaces, and therefore are more likely to demand better quality spaces from councils and commissioning bodies. So, and like you say, it takes practice. It historically takes the architectural industry time to get into these kind of technologies, but actually they are now. You can see a lot of practices coming on board. Some really great some practices really seeing it as a competitive advantage, if you want to put it that way, and actually producing really beautiful kind of drawings, communicating drawings, like you said, and communicating drawings, film, photography, all through their social media, and they're using it almost like a portfolio, which is really, really good to see.
And it's so important, and I think you make a great point early on with what you said there about it being personal. And I think for companies and practices these days, especially in an industry currently that I think is struggling a little bit in terms of getting work, getting clients, even employment, the whole world of architecture is a little bit kind of challenging. And so I feel like social media is an opportunity for people or practices to build brand recognition, to get their name out there for someone, because these days many students, they're not really looking, yes, they look at Design, they look at AJ, they look at the top 100, etc. But most of them are looking through social media, and they're looking for inspiration, or looking kind of like Pinterest. They look at it as a resource. And so it's almost silly for practices not to position themselves and place themselves in front of talent, that people are looking for jobs and looking for employment, the clients. And as you say, it typically seems to be younger people getting involved in it. I mean, there are some great profiles out there like Chris Simmons and Let's Show It Better, and they do a really great job of talking about architecture from a more kind of authoritative position and higher up, and someone who has more expertise, which is obviously great to see, and we need more of that. And I just see social media as an opportunity for the architecture profession to really utilize it, like I say, for brand recognition, to also show people what it's like to work in their practice. What is their culture like? What are the people there like? What are the personality of the culture? Because that's what people are interested in.
Yeah. And sorry, go on.
No, when you're looking for a job, it's one of the first things we think about is, okay, but what is it like to work for this company? What does the office look like? What are the people like? What is the diversity like, for example? And you can communicate all of that through social media. You can get an instant understanding of what the atmosphere and the kind of camaraderie is within the practice by looking at a profile, and which shows that inside kind of character of the practice.
And it's again, it's sort of just like you said earlier, you know, it is that place to have that personal connection, and every practice has a character, and it's interesting sometimes practices will forget what their character is, and they'll feel like they have to do everything.
Yeah.
And what social media maybe gives them an opportunity to do is sort of make a statement and say, this is who we are, this is what we stand for, these are our values.
Yeah, narrowing the focus and saying, look, this is our message, this is what we want to communicate. And I talk a lot when I speak about social media that there's kind of 3 core things to a social media brand. There's the message, what is the identity of the practice or the individual, and what is the message they want to communicate through their brand. What is their strategy? How are they going to communicate that message through their brand? Is it going to be through video content? Is it going to be through a podcast? Whatever it is. And then the process. How are they then going to create that content? What is the production process? What does it look like from going from an idea to publishing a piece of content on social media? And I think the crux of all of that is the message. What is it that you want to tell? What is the story? Going full circle back here with storytelling, what is that narrative that you want to communicate with your audience or with the world about your practice? And I think storytelling comes in many facets with social media, and I think it's such a, like I say, coming full circle again, it's just a great tool to use.
There's a variety of ways practices view social media from my experience. Typically it's either the ones that see it as a competitive advantage and they're kind of on one end of the spectrum, and on the other end you've got practices which see it as kind of something they feel they just have to do to keep up with the industry, the way the industry is going. And what I've found is actually it's not too difficult for practices to actually take advantage of, because, and I don't know if this is like your view also, they already produce the drawings, they already produce like you said, that from the inception of an idea all the way through to the end of the project, they've already got all this material, and it's just a case of almost framing it, packaging it, and those drawings are their philosophy. That's what they stand for. That's their character, and it's just a case of framing that, putting it on a platform in a way that others can get a bit of a peek into how they think and their ideas, their philosophies. And what do you
I mean, I think a very common thing for practices, like you say, is they just feel like it's a necessity. So they think, right, we've got a social media profile, we're going to post a couple pictures here and there, maybe once a week or once a month. We'll just show some updates on what we're working on, some awards maybe we've received. And that is like the typical generic architecture practice profile that you see. Every single profile has that kind of blueprint, that's how they approach it. But the more clever ones that are thinking about social media and actually thinking about a strategy and thinking, how can we use this to our benefit and gain a competitive advantage, gain a brand recognition, etc. They're utilizing trends. They're actually active users on the profile, so they're understanding trends, trending audios. They're utilizing different strategies like reels and short form content, understanding hooks and engagement and how to attract people's attention. And I feel like in architecture we have all the material there to, like you say, to communicate that. We've got all the material there, we just need to understand how to package it up in an engaging and effective way in order to gain an audience or get someone interested in the work. I think that the more difficult thing is that because architecture social media is still really infant, it's really in the early stage, there isn't necessarily solid advice out there on how to approach it. I mean, you can look at other industries and how they use it, but obviously that's very unique or niche to their industry, and they will have different ways of communicating their ideas and products. Whereas in the architecture industry, there's not really a precedent of how to do it. And I feel like that's where practices tend to struggle, because they don't quite understand, okay, well, yeah, we have this tool, we have social media, there's this opportunity, but we don't know how to go about this because there's nothing there to show what's the way of doing it. And so you end up having loads of profiles just posting pictures of their work and awards and stuff because that's what everyone else is doing. No one's really thinking about it in terms of utilizing the tool as an opportunity for real growth and real reach, which I think is where people like the personal brands, like I say, Chris Simmons, Let's Show It Better, who are utilising social media in the way that it should be utilised in order to target a younger audience and people that are actually want to engage with their content.
That's a really good point. In your view, how would you, and I can imagine there's many practices that do think like that, they sort of are quite intimidated by it, and it's almost understandable, it's not something that, I guess if you really kind of get it down to the crunch, they could say, well, it doesn't really directly win us work, therefore why should we put any resource into it? Now, what would you say to practices who kind of think in that sort of manner, have that view on it?
I mean, I think most practices have that point of view in it. They think, okay, what value does this bring to us? If we're going to invest our time and efforts, is it going to be worth it? And yeah, it's a valid question. And I think a lot of practices think from a client point of view. Okay, how can we get clients? How can we get work in? But I also think there's another point of view that practice should think about, and that is, how can we attract the best people? How can we get the best working culture? How can we get the best people working for us in order for us to, from the ground up, upscale our work and upskill our people in the office in order to produce better work, and kind of build from that point of view. So I think there's a major opportunity, one for attracting talent and people that want to work. At the end of the day, when you go for an interview, it's always a two-way interview. The practice sells their idea and their work to you. You then sell your work and skill to them. And then if you think there's a mutual kind of consensus between the two, then you move forward and work together. Social media is almost that opportunity, that pre-interview opportunity for an interviewee to look at the practice and be like, yeah, I really want to work with them, and I'm going to really push myself and upskill in order to position myself to work for them. And therefore the practice is going to get someone who's really keen to work for them. And so there's that point of view, the talent point of view.
Yes.
There's a brand recognition point of view. I mean, people across the world know the globally recognized brands, Zaha Hadid, Foster & Partners, Richard Rogers, all of these major architects. They're well known because the architects built an audience, they built a profile, they built a name for themselves, and that name has continued into their practice to help them win work, and there's that kind of status or profile. Whereas practices can also build that profile and status through social media. There's that opportunity there in order to build a reputation of the work that you do, the process that you have, your work culture, all of these things that we're talking about.
And I suppose, like, in a way, social media is quite democratic in that sense.
Yeah.
Because one could argue that Zaha Hadid, and Rogers, that Carver, they're big practices.
Yep.
Of course they've got the resources to do this, but actually it is free.
Yep.
And yes, it takes a bit of resourcing. Yep. But coming back to what you were saying, almost full circle, the idea that brand recognition, but also the fact that you're informing people, the general public, about what makes good architecture, what you believe makes good architecture, and you're contributing to that conversation of informing us and the general public of what it takes to design good spaces.
Yep.
And having your brand associated or having your practice associated with that conversation has value.
Yeah, and I think it's not always just about attracting people within the industry to your profession. It's also about teaching the world what we do as an industry, as a profession. Because I think architecture is a globally, there's obviously the whole conversation about the architect role being a very kind of flamboyant or kind of globally recognized position across the globe. I mean, at the end of the day, we're currently sat now in a space that is created by the formation of these buildings around us. Everything that we do in life is either in a building or related to a building. Everything we do is in architecture. So everyone has a level of interest in the profession and an interest in the industry. But it's just about educating them or bringing them into the profession and say, look, this is what we do. This is our role. This is what we bring. This is the value that we provide to society. And social media, once again, is another opportunity in order for us to communicate that to the general public who don't know anything about what the role of the architect is, what we do on a day-to-day basis. And I feel like that's someone like the Khizr Studio Podcast. They do a very good job in terms of talking in detail the day-to-day life of an architect and what the process is in architecture, which I think is great from someone who is an architecture student looking to get that role, but also just someone has no relation to the profession, also just understanding what we do on a day-to-day basis. And it's just that education and the accessibility and the democratisation, is that the right word? Yeah, democratisation of social media and the opportunity it presents is so limited.
Yeah.
So it blows my mind that we're not utilising it in the way that we should as a profession. And it is evolving 100%. And I just hope it continues to evolve, and hopefully a conversation like this helps people to gain that more insight into the value that we can bring to not only the profession but also to the wider audience.
Absolutely, that's fantastic, Tom, and you speak really eloquently about this, by the way. So I look forward to seeing like where
I try to. It's quite different. It's such a difficult and complicated thing. It's really hard to condense down into an hour podcast or however long this is. I could talk about this for days and weeks. But yeah, no, I appreciate it. I'm trying to condense the information down as best as I can.
No, I think you've done a really good job, actually. And to move the conversation on, onto the kind of the next point, kind of to take it a bit deeper, we were talking about how there's already, like, practices can use their existing material, and that can be form a basis of how they can present themselves on social media platforms. There's also the idea of and this is something that I'm quite interested in with my own studio, with Khizr Studio, the idea of historically within academia, we've studied at university and we've studied in what I sort of term the analogue modes of communication. So your drawings and photography and written word and things like this. And it's very recently that the barrier to entry for let's call them sensory modes of communication, film, multimedia, like film, sound, and animation have kind of become accessible.
Yeah.
And we said earlier, like, it takes practice some time to get into these new technologies, these new methodologies and new ways of working. But what's interesting is one of the things that I'm interested in when I tutor at university, tutor architecture students, is the idea of we typically learn the analog modes of communication, like drawing and photography, and written word, and that's how we express our stories in architecture school. And what if we could, now that we have these sensory modes of communication, let's call them, film and sound and animation, now that these are more accessible to us as an industry, what are the ways in which we could capitalize on these and not just see it as a necessary evil, but see it as something that could make our work richer and kind of hybridize the analog with the sensory. So have drawings, have your section drawings, your plan drawings, have your perspectives, but also bring in something more emotive, maybe film. There's certain things that you can get with film that you can't get with a plan, for instance. The understanding of an atmosphere, the understanding of time, through a project, that's something that film can bring in. So if we're looking at kind of the social media lens, as we're doing here, and we're talking about how practices can express themselves on social media, how architects can express themselves on social media, do you think that sort of celebrating these new tools that we have, the film, animation, and sound, and etc., do you think celebrating this, do you think practices need to almost sort of not have to, but almost it could make their work more three-dimensional or more richer if they incorporate these modes of storytelling?
I think at the end of the day, it comes back to what we started the conversation on, that's communication. I think in architecture it is important for us to explore different modes of communication or different mediums of communication. Obviously you have the fundamental tools like you mentioned, the drawing, the floor plan, the elevations, etc., which is all the two-dimensional drawings. You then have the next level of that, which is the 3D modeling, which shows a more 3D and perspective point of view. And you have renders and everything, which are obviously the staples to what we do in architecture, which is what we use in practice. And you obviously now have video, which I think this conversation is going explaining more about, like you say, the multimedia approach of communication and the sensory approach of communication.
The other thing to also mention, obviously, with this multimedia approach, as you say, is that it is accessible to non-architects. that becomes accessible, because although we as architects who've spent 5+ years studying and training understand how to interpret a plan, understand how to interpret a section, the majority of the people, 99% of the public, don't really have an interest and don't really care about that kind of thing. But if you can communicate spatial quality, temporal quality, emotive quality of a space to them through something incredibly short and succinct and elegant and efficient, let's say through a social media post or a short film, 30 seconds, then they get it and they understand something which, and it can even be a way for us architects to understand space in a way which a drawing can't project.
Yeah, and I think, as you mentioned, with the different forms of communication or tools that we have available to us, the drawing is obviously the fundamental piece that we have as an architect or in architecture in order to communicate how something can be constructed. And obviously the blueprint of a building, essentially that's the crux of what a drawing is, the elevation, the section, the plan, etc. They obviously are fundamental communication tools that we have. And for all architect students, make sure you learn how to do a floor plan and what that communicates. But you're definitely right in the kind of multimedia approach and the more sensory approach of video, audio, and even a hybrid between the two. And I think there's obviously a lot of examples out there of how you can cross over digital and analog, and also analog and video, and kind of mix and match.
And that's where it becomes really interesting.
Yeah, and that's where it adds layers to the communication. And like you say there, video is obviously a universal tool. Someone can look at a video, and if it's put together nicely and it's curated nicely and it's got a good story, then it's a universal tool that people can understand and connect to and feel that emotion. A drawing, like you say, is a universal tool, but within architecture, I find it's not. If you've got a really complex plan of a really complex development, some average person is going to look at that and have no idea what's going on and really struggle to identify what's happening.
And that then also enforces that barrier that we have of accessibility between practice and people.
100%. And then you've got the render, which is a very quick and easy way, which is why we use that for clients, because it helps clients visualize how the building is going to look. If you literally put it in a very realistic scenario and show them this is what it could look like, then that's a great tool. But yeah, like you say, video just adds that additional layer, animations add that additional layer, and sound to get that feeling of experience and that feeling of atmosphere and that feeling of how you would feel in that space, which I think at the end of the day is what we are designing for. We're designing spaces in order to create stories, in order to create experiences, to make people feel a certain emotion. We don't develop buildings based on a drawing, or well, we do, but you know what I mean. There's a more of a sensory and an additional extra layer element to it. Therefore, I think we should use a hybrid communication approach. And to go back to your comment earlier on about talking about architecture students utilising multiple communication tools, I do think that's important. And I think for an architecture student point of view, I can understand why they're hesitant to learn something more, because they're already told to learn this, told to learn that. They need to do this, need to produce all of these different drawings. If you then tell them to go and make a video and then do an audio and then do a hybrid drawing, it's going to blow their minds, which I understand. But the fundamental point is that if they're interested and they want to pursue further the communication of their portfolios and projects and make it richer and make it more of an experience and tell more of a deeper story, then 100% video, audio is the way to go. And I mean, even in my journey through architecture school, I tried to incorporate animation and video into my work, and I did it in quite a not so obvious way. So some of my drawings were literally animated. Some of the models I created were a kind of expression of, or a kind of a concept of film, and rather than it explicitly being a film. And so there's different ways of doing it, there's different ways of approaching it, and I guess it's all about just maximizing the tools that we have relating to communication, to social media, all of these tools that we have in order, once again, to tell a story. And that's the crux of what we do in architecture, is to communicate stories.
That's it. And if we focus on the storytelling being the thing that we're trying to do, that we're experts at, actually, architects are very good at storytelling when it comes to architecture. And I almost personally view architecture school as the architecture course as a storytelling course. It almost is a storytelling course. And if we remember that is the thing, then I think we'll be less hesitant, or like less afraid of these other modes of communication.
You make a, sorry to jump in there, you make a very good point there, and I do the same. I look at the architecture process as almost like a film. And I actually talk about it a lot in my content. I try and kind of demystify what the concept of a project is, because I think the idea of a concept and this kind of idea that runs through the project is quite a complicated thing to get your head around. But the way I try and explain it to people is to think of an architecture concept in the same way that you think of a plot for a movie. The plot of the movie is essentially the idea or the overarching narrative that drives all of the sequence of events that happens throughout the movie. It drives the order of the movie, it drives how the movie is put together, the stories that are told, the characters within the movie. And essentially, when we build a portfolio, it's the same thing, or build a project. You have the concept, which comes as the core to the project. The concept, it runs through the entire project and navigates every design decision that you make. You always refer back to the concept. Whenever you're making the design decision or drawing something, you've always got to think, okay, but what's the concept? Does this relate to the concept? Is this kind of piecing together? If you think about it in that way, there are so many parallels between a movie and an architecture project. Obviously, there's that technical side of things when it comes to architecture and actually technically in delivering a building itself. Obviously, but I'm thinking more from a communication point of view and a portfolio point of view, in that you have a start, an end, and a middle. You have the start, which is normally the idea. You have the middle, which is the design development, and then you have the end, which is the final product, the solution, which is typically a set of drawings that depicts a building. The same that you have a movie, you have the start, you have the middle, you have the start where it kind of identifies this character and their problem or what they're trying to explore. You have a middle, which then that takes them through that journey of trying to find that solution. Then you have the conclusion. Very similar thing. There has so many parallels and draws so many parallels, and I find that really fascinating. And you're right, if we can start, I mean, it's obviously something that you have to get your head around, but if you start thinking about architecture in that way, it is all fundamentally about story, and it all relates back to storytelling and how we communicate ideas and who we communicate them to. And in order to, our sole purpose is to get an idea all the way through to a final product, and selling that idea to an individual, whether it's a client, whether it's a colleague, whether it's a tutor, whether it's a critique, whether it's a peer, or any stakeholder in a project. It's all about communicating that idea and getting it across as best as you can.
Yeah, and I absolutely love that analogy of the film. And to take it sort of a step deeper, you could almost imagine, if you look at certain urban principles, I've used this example before, but in A Patterns Language by Christopher Alexander, he talks about how a successful urban environment is one which has expansion and contraction of space. So there's less monotony in your journey. There's more richness, more diversity in the types of spaces you're experiencing throughout your journey through a city, for example. And if you look at a film, for instance, the rhythm of a film, there will be kind of points of intensity and moments of intensity in that film. Like you said, there'll be that kind of core narrative, which will be a sort of a crescendo. But then you'll have bits that build up to that, and you'll have sub-narratives, and you'll have secondary and tertiary narratives. And in an architectural project, it's the same thing, where we have this kind of core primary narrative, this core driver or concept. Exactly like you said, and you almost have a web of secondary and tertiary ideas and concepts that feed into that. And when it comes to the storytelling, it's so important that you've got really, usually no more than a couple minutes, whether it's in a university review crit or in practice when you're giving a pitch or presentation, you've got maybe 10 minutes to communicate a couple of really core themes and core ideas. And And then another sort of, I suppose, concept that you could cross over between film and architecture is maybe scale. You know, in architecture, scale is so important, looking at urban scale right down to the human scale, the granular level. And in film, it's the same thing. A successful film has that sort of those layers of richness where you're exploring a certain topic or a theme from various scales. So it's really yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, it's really
fascinating.
Cool. And also you could even apply the same concept to music. Music also is a rhythmic art, and the same way architecture is, the same way film is. You know, it's about rhythm, it's about attention, and it's about moments of intensity. And those moments are what define the character of a space in architecture, or a song in music, or a film.
100%. And I think I actually wrote a dissertation on the parallels between architecture and music, and I explored Daniel Libeskind and his references to music notation, and it's really interesting when you actually go a little bit deeper. Obviously some of it becomes quite philosophical and theoretical, which I think is important in architecture, to explore that philosophical side of things. But there are so many tangents between these different industries, and I think that really boils down to the multidisciplinary potential of architecture, and the fact that we aren't just this profession that is kind of single and independent, but we also spread out into many different facets, in the same way that I was talking about earlier, in that architecture is in our day-to-day life constantly. It's around us constantly. Architecture facilitates everything that we do. Therefore, it must branch out into so many different professions and industries, because otherwise we can't create fruitful space and fruitful architecture for people to live in. And yeah, it's fascinating, and I think we could sit here for hours going into all of that. And it's really great that you mentioned music, because I think that's really interesting.
Well, no, it's really interesting that you did your dissertation on it as well, and like you said, you know, we're not sort of an island. You know, we and the moment we realise that architecture is a form of poetry, as is music, as is film, and when you view it, I suppose, on that level, you can start to draw these connections, which you can actually start to become influenced by different mediums, which is so. It's such an odd idea that music, which is something in a sense ephemeral and not physical, can influence design. It can almost have a crossover of philosophies and concepts into something like architecture, which is so physical and has a kind of a physical output.
And I feel like that's, for a lot of people in the profession, I feel like that's where we go wrong as an industry. We try and island ourselves. We try and say, no, look, we're this mighty profession. We're up here. We're above everyone else. We don't. But no, we need everyone. We need everything, and everyone's knowledge and the input of everything. And I think gatekeeping of knowledge and gatekeeping and this authoritative position that people have in architecture, I think social media helps break those boundaries and really helps this education and the accessibility to architecture. And yeah, I think
exactly, and you brought it back to social media, which is exactly what I was going to say, is that it can become that one place where all these different social media, it's interesting, it's almost this one place where all these forms of art and these crafts can exist and can be accessed fairly easily, and without kind of the accessibility issues that we might have. And it can be a great place for students to get ideas, but also for practices to kind of express their uniqueness and their character.
100%.
Well, I think we've had a really great conversation there, Tom, about social media, architecture, storytelling, film, music. Is there anything else you want to sort of say to close off? I mean, maybe some ideas on where you see all of this going, coalescing or not in the future?
Yeah, I think just a couple final things to say, really. It's just, I really think architecture social media is in its infancy, and that this is just the beginning, really. And there are so many amazing profiles out there, but I believe there's going to be tenfold that in the next few years. And I really hope practices start realizing the value in this tool that we have. I think I should draw some parallels to kind of other technologies that have come into the space, such as AI, and obviously people see AI and they think, oh my word, it's going to take over my job. This is going to make me jobless. This is such a crazy, scary thing. The same conversations happened when social media came about. And I just still feel like the architecture profession is almost just lagging a bit behind, and they see it as something that's a bit scary and a bit like, oh, we don't want to put ourselves out there. We don't want people to see what we're doing. We want it to still be quite gatekept. And as I've mentioned, and we've discussed accessibility, I think soon, hopefully, practice will realise the value that social media presents. And in my journey, I'm going to continue exploring social media. My brand is going to continue to evolve and develop, hopefully, with my journey and just kind of other things that are going on in my life and my interest in architecture. I feel like a great thing with my profile is it very much follows my interests, and I've curated a profile that I look at and I would enjoy watching that content. So I've almost become an audience, a target audience myself, and that's really helped me identify what I find value in my brand, and basically I think it's going to continue to evolve and grow with my interest in the field. And hopefully when I become an architect and things kind of move forward in my career, then we'll see where it takes me, and I'm really kind of looking forward to it. And I think listening to about your journey and we've obviously spoke off camera about what you're doing, and I feel like what you're doing and what you're bringing to the architecture profession is so valuable when it comes to video and cinematography and communicating architecture through video. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what comes of all of this.
Thank you. That's really kind of you, Tom. And I'm really looking forward to seeing where you go as well in future. And it would be great if we can do some more work together, actually. And
100%, we can make it happen.
Absolutely. And where can people follow you?
Instagram is Tom Rose Studios. YouTube is Thomas Rowntree. LinkedIn, Thomas Rowntree. I mean, yeah, just Tom Rose Studios is kind of the core of my brand, and yeah, that's
amazing. We'll put the links at the bottom, and
that
people can follow you and follow your journey. Amazing.
Great. Thank you, Khizr.
Yeah, thank you, Tom.
Appreciate
really
it.
Lovely to have you on. Thank you.